Okay, so I'll try to be brief, but you know I won't. I'll try. So first of all, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. I would have loved to be able to give this kind of talk, and I never had anywhere that I could. A lot of us, so I started thinking about larger than technology in Estonia in 2007. I came there to do incident response to help Hilar with the CERT when Russia attacked, supposedly, of course, Estonia. And I came away thinking about strategy, thinking about social psychology, and I started growing with it. And I started saying, okay, I want to talk about defense, but I also want to talk about higher level strategy, and I have nowhere to go. And once in a while, I would meet somebody like Sunil, and late into the night, we would find a Russian diner in San Francisco and talk for hours. And I saw it as collecting people, which sounds kind of creepy, right? That we can talk about this. Who models things? Who is trying to push things forward? Now, so I'm just happy to be here, to be honest. So about me, CEO of Symmetria, startup in the cyber deception space. I've been with PwC, Israeli government. I've even worked for 4 months as a VP at Kaspersky, just so you know. They're nice people, and I appreciate my time there. Now, this is the only bit of introduction I'll actually do. We know these patterns. That is what we do in many cases. When we work in incident response, when we work in the trenches, we notice patterns. And the patterns we notice are not just about investigation. It's about we do this again and again and again. Just the name of the threat or the name of the asset or the name of the platform changes. And at some point, if you're like me, you start saying, wait, so is there a pattern to how this repeats? Is there a pattern to how we can predict the future? Or, more to the point, is there a pattern to how we can respond better? So, looking at this incident response or groundwork kind of scenario, I gave a talk 2 years ago where the assumption was, this was a talk I prepared 6 years before that, but I had nowhere to give, amazingly enough. And the assumption was, we're going to try and win. But what we always do is encounter a superbug, by analogy to biology. So if we're going to lose, how can we take that assumption of a superbug and instead try to play that game? Try to shift the evolution around, try to make the window bigger, longer, before we reach the superbug, reverse the evolution, whatever it is. And I don't want to discuss that right now, but the point was, how can we model what we actually do and approach things better? And that was a strategic talk about operations. But other models started occurring to me, and one of them was my constant frustration with trying to be Cassandra. It's not that I'm always right. I am not a prophet. But us, when we are in the trenches, we see things. We know they are going to become a problem because we have seen it before. We can see the pattern of the evolution of how the proliferation of a zero-day works. All of these things. So what we start doing again and again is saying, you know, this is going to be big. And nobody cares. And that is so frustrating. So I went through being in incident response I created some of the very first information sharing groups and task forces, the global incident response task forces. I've done all of those things out of frustration and my personal liking of people, which is kind of surprising, you know. What am I doing in security if I like people? But then, Win Schwartzo, who has been here before, and we all like, was in Congress in 1991, and he told them foreign nation states are going to attack the US over the internet. They laughed him out, right? And what I'm saying right now is the frustration head of a security guy. I'm going to take that off in a second and be very friendly, maybe. But I was there too, with various threats. For example, my first big one, trying to explain to people this is going on, was botnets. Nobody wanted to listen. Like, up to the year of the worm, 2003, when they just saw worms everywhere, and I could see all these botnets happening and all this criminal infrastructure, and nobody cared. I started to understand there is a process of education, and I cannot go against the market. I can't keep climbing sleek walls. What I need to do is identify these economic waves of sorts and try to either go with them or create them. That is the only way we can affect change, for me, anyway. Or you can shout and scream and maybe win, but you will also lose a lot, right? We have all done that before, especially me. I'm glad that people grow up, especially me. And moving on from that, my question to you to begin here is, When, not if, when did this happen to you? Just raise your hands if it happened to you before that you saw something is going to happen. It's important, but nobody cares. Frustrating, right? So I can't, today, unlike a couple of years ago, I'm not going to present a model. I'm going to go through very quick and selective history, because we've had a lot of talks about economics and history here, and there is no reason for that. And then I'm going to skip to my suggestion of what we need to do and what I've done so far. So, we tend to not invest in future problems. I believe we'll all agree to that. And the question I bring immediately up, should we have invested in security in the 80s and the 90s? The security guy, the answer is absolutely yes. I remember Jim Christie, the first cyber agent in the world and most senior DoD official in cyber for many, many for decades, came and said, whenever I establish and I put an agent for cyber in the field, I always get complaints that suddenly we have more cyber incidents. So, should we have invested? I don't know. As a security guy, absolutely. But honestly, putting on the hat of a decision maker with all the other threats out there and the proof points we have to make the decision by, maybe not. So, the second thing, which is more important for me for this talk, is we tend to create our own problems. Rather than cyber is out there, information security is out there, hacking, it's a problem, we tend to create our own, IoT, right? And specifically, we build new technology without security in mind. So as a good security person, I'll say, they should build security in. We should replace TCP/IP. Please, but no, it's probably not going to happen. So we need to face the after effects. And when we do, I start thinking, wait, we've done this before, and I start creating a list of technology waves, as I call them. The mainframe, the mini computer, the PC, cell phones, RFID, cable modems, which became IoT. Drones, AI, cars, and all of these things start, for various good reasons that I can't fault if I take my security hat off, with no security whatsoever, which usually is equivalent of telnet and defaults. You can just connect and do whatever you want, right? Now, with drones, it's SDR with just emulating the controls, right? Always the same thing. And this is with other technologies as well. It can be operating system technologies. It doesn't have to be about security. So, when we start looking at technology waves, I ask, why do we ignore the risk? Well, first, can we actually identify a future problem? This is a quick interlude. And the answer is, I have a lot of answers of my own. I would like to talk about this for 3 hours. I'm not going to. Instead, I took a model, because I like models, from somebody else, John Sweeney, a UK guy, I think MOD, and I took 3 of his slides. Number 1, known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns, right? Can we identify some of these? Can't we identify some of these? How do we go about it? And so on and so forth. We've seen this before, I believe, everybody here. So he actually takes the black swan idea and expands on it. And he says, black swans are very rare, but they're predictable. Then he adds, we have black elephants. Things that will certainly happen that nobody is making plans for. Oh yeah. And then lastly, black jellyfish, which I love, is impossible to even imagine, but when they do happen, all breaks down. So far, so good, right? We need to identify what we can't know. We can also agree on other models. We don't necessarily have to agree with this one. But essentially, a familiar future, you have a rare event that alters the status quo in such a significant fashion, but it was something you could predict. Then you have an extended present, right, where everything stays pretty much status quo. So far, so good, right? But we might face the challenge if it goes on that way. And lastly, again, translating the thought, and by the way, this is Gary Warner, all those who know him, he gave me this, so I really appreciate that. Unthought of future, something entirely unpredictable happens. Future is greatly altered from our beliefs. So now that we have that settled down, we can move forward and say, what do we do with this? So skipping the entire talk that this person gave, I thought we can do a lot, depending on the type of threat. We can resist, we can create resilience to handle what we don't know, we can even respond to the different things that we might face. But that's not the idea of the talk. That was an interlude to define something about what we might face that we don't know, or do we ignore, all that stuff. So assuming we can foresee the problem, assuming it's now a known known, just to make it easy, we're still not likely to invest in it. So far, so good? Awesome. So let's move on and quote Asimov, because I love Asimov. He's amazing. He built my life, right? The Foundation series, amazing. Any fool can tell a crisis when it arrives. The real service to the state, notice that, right, is to detect it in embryo. I was like, yeah, I love that. I love that quote. Let's save it. I look at it 10 years later when I read the Foundation series again, and nope. Detecting the threat is almost meaningless. It's the first step. It's a pre-requirement, but it doesn't mean we'll actually be successful. So, of course, I can look to Fernando and his talk 2 years ago, and Kelly helped me remember this, where we have hyperbolic discounting. Burger now, health later. We don't want to deal with it, right? But there's a lot of other things. It doesn't hurt us right now, so we don't kick at it, right? We have other priorities. We have go-to-market pressures. So far, so good, right? Our MVP actually becomes the product, and we need to build on top of it again and again more patches. We have limited resources, and security isn't even thought of. It just didn't occur to us because we are in an economic drive to innovate. Awesome, fine, nope. So what next? So I'm saying there is a business sense. Again, taking my security hat off, maybe we shouldn't invest in security at this stage when we have no proof point early in the technology wave. So taking the security hat off, and please do the same, suspend disbelief with me, I would say it's difficult to say whether a problem will materialize. And the reason for that is because in many cases it hasn't, right? Otherwise, we would pretty easily pattern match and do whatever we need to do with new problems. So this is the classic example on that. Horse manure. Britain, early 20th century. I want to read the above. The Times newspaper predicted in 50 years, every street in London will be buried under 9 feet of manure. And there have been many other examples. Imagine starting to invest in this problem, and there has been a lot of discussion around the problem, so on and so forth. And after all that investment, the car comes along. Is this really a problem you want to work on? So we zig and we zag. What should we actually do? So for me, if we invest too early, we may be wasting resources. If we invest too late, the challenges could become effectively insurmountable, which is a big word that I chose, right? And the problem for us as practitioners becomes, how can we convince people? We have detected it. We understood that it's very likely to happen, but how do we actually go about convincing them? We don't, because we'll fail again and again. And this is a basic, I just drew this up. A friend of mine helped me because she knows Photoshop, even though it's simple, right? And I just use it as a model to say 2 things. Number 1, a technology wave occurs, right? We'll all agree on this. The longer we take in investing in security, the more it's going to cost. Everybody agrees? Great. The longer we wait to invest in security, the less it's going to do. Can we follow that? Even far from linearly. And lastly, the longer we take to invest in security, the less impact we'll have. But knowing this as a truth, I mean, we can disagree with it. I strongly believe, but we can argue about it later and maybe source it a little bit. But the more we look at this, I say it's not enough. So what made me start exploring this is that it has worked once before that I know. Israel, late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of the people, civilians in Israel said, we need to do something about information security, not cyber. And it took a while, and over my dead body, over his dead body, political issues with creating new laws, they created a new law that essentially established a center will give guidance on security for critical infrastructure. That was it. Now, honestly, in the late 90s, to get a government to make that move is insane. So I said, I wanted so much more with my security, and I said, that's just not enough. But I'm willing to accept that. Can I replicate that? Can I make sure that in the future when a technology wave hits us and we see by various means which I will not go into right now, and there have been enough talks about prediction, but if we actually know it's going to happen or believe strongly it's going to happen or we see the signs, whatever, can we replicate this success? That somebody will invest a little bit so what we do later will actually be meaningful. Make sense so far? And that's where the call to action kind of starts, where I'm saying convince decision makers to invest just enough early. So when we start the technology wave, we don't have enough proof points. That's the definition of the problem I'm putting down here. So I'm trying to look at previous technology waves. What proof points have we had in previous technology waves that we can try to show repeat themselves? So the mainframe, I'm not old enough. Maybe some of you are. The mini computer, the PC, I can tell you the mainframe, the operating system level became very advanced. Some of the security measures there are very advanced that we never replicated. So that's kind of a shame. But we can see PC, cell phones, all of these different things had clear proof points on what happened until people started caring. So For me, I want to look at each of these waves, and more importantly, the long tail after the wave of the effect of not investing in security or trying to invest later on, and then say, let's examine all these previous proof points and how these threats came to be, and then when we encounter a new technology wave, we come and say, hey, you're becoming important. That's one of the critical, whatever it is, people rely on you, which is one of the categories for me to look into the future, and then show them what happened before. If we can find somebody who cares, of course, which is important, or we can make it a regulation, or we can, whatever it is, something small. And going back here, I would ask for about a minute, can anybody look at anything on this list, let's say the PC to make it easy, and give me a proof point that it was critical. Enough bodies have been buried, forgive the analogy, so people cared. What were these proof points? Just out of your mind, out of your head, yes. I love you, Worm, right? Okay, love letter. Anybody else? Yes, what? It shut down everything, yes. Vista, no, very nice. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Soviets listening into the grain market. I'll go with that. Okay, anybody else? Yes. Social aspects of things like America Online, I'll go with that. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, so I didn't go as far as you did, although I think we should. We should move to the benefit side, to the impact side, but I decided to limit, and I agree with that, and I really am thankful that you guys went there, but I started a little bit smaller. I said, there is an academic vulnerability research. Nobody cares. I care. They care. But academic, of course, could be a researcher. But what I'm saying, it's theoretical. I should have written theoretical. They're interested hackers. Maybe an intelligence agency does some activity around it because it's a new realm they can exploit. Criminal activity comes along. And then I skipped a long way down to a major worm. A major worm happens. Everybody goes down. Everybody's panicked. They start to establish things. So these were the proof points I just chose for this exercise. And then I moved on and looked at it again. I started going through it. We can do it together, but I think you get the point. We can move on to get to what I actually want to do. So what's next? I want to find the decision makers and or the influencers that will listen, will care to listen. And then I want to try and create an, air quote, Israel-like shift. A very, very small shift that can help us in the future. So what I've done so far, I've engaged through, for example, the World Economic Forum and others, with production and supply chain industries. They're overlooked, but they're a third of our, I don't want to throw numbers out there, a third of, let's say, our economy or our employers. I forget the exact statistic right now, forgive me. And I'm speaking at their events. And I'm telling them things when they do ask about security. They now know who their security person is, which is much better than nothing. They go through the process, which is the process CEOs went through about 3-4 years ago. So starting that ball rolling is very important for me. Then AI. Not for the buzzword, and not because I know much about AI, but it is one of the technology waves that are up and coming. So I spoke with quite a few AI experts until one day I met this person who wrote the book on AI. It's being taught in most places when they learn about machine learning or AI around the world. And he said, you know what? I'm willing to add a chapter of security to my book. Amazing. Awareness. People will understand a little bit about security, not a lot, when they work on or study AI. I think that's a major step forward for a small event that could shift things. Then we get to medical devices. And I'm like, oh man, what do we do now, right? That's the nightmare scenario. Medical devices. So we today in the world get about 1 million new people a year who are implanted with a pacemaker only, not considering other medical devices. Now naturally there's been research about vulnerabilities, something about 8,000, whatever it is. I remember in 2007 when I started caring about this, it was less, but still, that is a major threat. Now, there is an analogy to the car industry I'll get to later, but essentially, we already have home reporting, where they can communicate with their doctor in some fashion. What about remote updating? That's gonna happen if it hasn't happened already. And wireless protocols. They're working on this. This is where it's going. And then it enters our realm. Now, I don't wanna think about all the proof points that might happen, and I really hate FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt, insecurity. I prefer to speak in numbers, I prefer to speak in enablement, I prefer to speak in business terms or strategic terms, but honestly, FUD, that's what I care about right now. If there is a worm out there in a couple of years that kills everybody with a pacemaker through the internet update system. Man, I don't like that. So what do I do with that? How do I approach that? Because I don't want to scare people. How can I do that Israel level event like I'm trying to do in AI, like I'm trying to do with production? So I would say, I don't know how. I'm trying. Device manufacturers are actually taking note. They're actually working on this, but I don't see any shift yet. And it's going to take them time. But they do take note. Number two, there is a whole idea of the infectious diseases aspect. There is whole monitoring through the World Health Organization when you see new things happening. Somebody is sick for more than 24 hours without being identified, I think 24 hours, without the disease being identified. Today, they wouldn't even think to look for something computer-related. Let's be honest, if somebody does die because of a pacemaker exploitation thing, would we have any logs there to begin with to be able to do forensics? Would anybody think to do forensics on the device? So meaning, if I'm going to, somebody dies, they go to the morgue, nobody would even think to look at their pacemaker, I believe. And if they do, they have no forensics to work with or tools to be able to exploit these forensics. So we have a long way to go, even if investment is being done. And I don't know what that first step is, but I'm looking for it desperately. It does depend on who the person is. That's what I said, buddies. It can be one buddy if it's a really important person, but it can be many others for people to start caring. So moving on from this, even if we succeed, which is the car industry analogy, we're close to the end here. I remember when, I think it was Charlie's hack, when the car industry said, yeah, you know what? But let's wait until it actually, what's the wireless protocol again for the, that we talked about? I forget. For cars? Cass. CARBUS, you said it's called? CAN bus. Thank you. I always forget about that protocol. I don't know why it can't stick in my mind. So the idea is, if an exploit happens there, we would care. Guess what happened next? Right? Because there was already the infrastructure for that. So this is a long process. We're not going to solve it, even if we had a perfect solution. But I would like to give you a tidbit. Say that we lived in a world where companies actually tried to make a decision on whether they should invest in this or not and when. We have some, so math comes to our, math helps us. There is always a math help. Math can solve our problems and all that stuff. I don't believe we live in this world, but rent, lease, or buy. What do you do when you go skiing, right? How much do you spend? How much are you going to spend over time? When should you move from renting to buying? And they built an entire, this is their presentation. I just took one of their slides. But the idea is, they actually thought about that. If you want to make the decision, it's workable. So if we lived in a world where a company actually said, we want to try and create a sort of risk measurement over when we should start investing in security, when we shouldn't, how much we should, there is work out there to help us do it that is not just, we're security people and we're worried about it. So I appreciated finding this one. And somebody helped me with this. I'm not much in math, so thank you. So more work needed, of course. But specifically, can we as a community identify the threats that matter? Not as people, not as companies, the big threats, instead of just saying IoT. Then, number two, how do we do a better job at approaching the decision makers? Maybe even as a lobby. Maybe this starts here. Maybe work with WEF. And number three, more qualified work. Numbers. Measurements that we can actually show and prove rather than the proof points I personally believe matter over these technology waves and the long tail that they entail. Thank you. I can speak of many other things, but I choose not to. The only thing I want to say is the way I'm going about this today is proof points over multiple waves because I don't have enough proof points in current waves. And that is how I'm approaching various industries. And it's working for me to a very limited degree, but nothing has worked yet before now. So this is more of a call to action to think about this and see how we can work together as opposed to the model that I presented a couple of years ago on how we can actually engage in a better way. If that makes sense, then that's great. If not, then I'll try harder. Thank you so much for listening to me.